Your Highnesses, Excellencies, dignitaries, delegates, ladies and gentlemen. It gives me great pleasure to be with you here today and to be given this opportunity to share my thoughts on the Indian model of CSR, which in many research papers has come to be called the Chatterjee model. If I were to think of a title of my speech for today, it would be India's Path-Breaking CSR Mandate, Reflections on the Journey. In a very real sense, the history of modern strategic CSR in India began with the issuance of the first ever guidelines which were applicable for central public sector undertakings, made effective from the 1st of April 2010. These were a set of comprehensive instructions to public sector companies on the modalities that they needed to adopt for executing their CSR activities. These historic guidelines were the precursor to the ensuing legislation of 2013, and they already incorporated many of the salient features that were to be embedded in Section 135 of the Companies Act of 2013. This section on the passage of the Act changed the entire CSR landscape for India Incorporated, bringing within its ambit all companies above a certain level of profits, net worth, and turnover. The new law, in a brief and succinct manner, laid down several provisions that raised the bar for CSR activities to a whole new level. Effective 1st of April 2014, the Companies Act of the Government of India laid down that companies which have net profits of US dollar 700,000 or more, or a net worth of 200 million US dollars or more, or a turnover of 100 US dollars or more in any financial year, private limited or public limited, listed or unlisted, would have to spend a minimum of 2% of their profits on corporate social responsibility. Today, approximately 11,000 of India's richest and most successful companies fall under the purview of the Act. They collectively bring in approximately 3 billion US dollars into India's economic development and address directly the needs of the poor, the deprived, and the underprivileged. The mandate by itself is simple, easy to understand, and provides ample elbow room and flexibility to the corporate entity. The numerous multi-stakeholder debates, consultations, and awareness generation forums that preceded the passage of the legislation ensured this. The Companies Act made CSR spending a statutory obligation for companies incorporated under the Act, thus ensuring that companies deriving commercial benefit from business operations participate in the growth and the development of that very society from which they derive their profits. It must be remembered that the unique Indian legislation also had a unique reason for being passed. The raison d'etre of the new law, first of its kind anywhere in the world, was simple and direct. Provide to Indian private sector the chance to participate in the inclusive development agenda of our nation. Whereas development would continue to remain the primary responsibility of the government, corporate entities would now be given the opportunity and scope of complementing and supplementing government's efforts. There was also another very strong reason. It is a truism across our entire world, and particularly in South Asia, that the implementation programs of governments are notoriously slow. Processes of governments are tardy and often riddled with leakages. By contrast, the implementation now conceived by the private sector would harness their well-known strengths: flexibility, agility, innovation, close monitoring and supervision, outcome orientation, and value for money. Thirdly, the idea was to harness the ground level grassroots capabilities of India's NGO and civil society sector. We have an estimated 3 million NGOs registered in India. They bring to the implementation process their competencies and knowledge, thereby imparting to all our CSR efforts a mass level orientation which we have never seen before. The main thrust and spirit of the law was therefore twofold. Focus on the poor, the marginalized, and the downtrodden. Generate a conducive environment for enabling the corporates to conduct themselves in a socially responsible manner while contributing towards human development goals of the country. Several new facets were also brought into play, creating not just a paradigm but a tectonic shift from the traditional manner in which CSR objectives were generally being pursued, but mostly by countries across the world. It is these new facets that made the Indian legislation so distinctive and so different. So, what are these new facets? Let me just list them one by one. First, unhitch CSR from the traditional horse cart of philanthropy, charity, and mere checkbook writing. Do away with the approach of donor and receiver. Treat recipients as partners. Begin the whole thought process with the beneficiary directly in mind. Remember the adage, what is not measured is usually not done. Therefore, for all your CSR activities, there must be good monitoring and good evaluation. Move away from storytelling and anecdotal narratives. Focus on hard, objective data. Realize that the do no harm principle is no longer the acceptable norm. CSR efforts need to go beyond in a positive and concrete direction. Look upon each single CSR activity as a standalone project. Give it a start date, give it an end date. Provide both monetary and human resources to the project. Assign a credible implementing agency in the shape of an NGO or a voluntary organization or non-profit to ensure meticulous documentation and monitoring. Create a clear and cogent CSR policy for the company. Constitute a board-level CSR committee so that the entire process of implementation is monitored at the highest level. Report to government each year in a specific format the details of the CSR projects that companies execute. A whole new regimen was sought, therefore, to be created that suited Indian conditions best. The companies were required now to undertake sustainable activities under CSR in a program mode with measurable outcomes. After the passage of the legislation, companies required a little bit of time to understand what this new approach was going to mean. It is not as though companies had not been doing CSR before. Many companies, in the tradition of our Indian heritage, had been doing a lot of philanthropic, donation, and other work. But now we were moving from that level to the level of strategic CSR. And we were now saying that it's not good enough to write a check or do a donation. Every CSR activity now had to be a project which had a certain period of time. The idea was that you could then actually evaluate what the impact of that work was. And so a whole new area of studies has developed, which is called impact measurement. Companies are now saying that when we do a project on the ground and we say, let's take a particular area and we help the schools in that area, what are the measurable outcomes? So if you say that the pass percentage in those schools was 53%, when the project finishes after 2 years or 3 years, has the pass percentage gone up? And therefore, it's not just about distributing things, but at the end of the project, saying what difference did it make in real terms? Did the monthly income of the women for whom we did women's empowerment, did their monthly incomes show a rise? If so, what percentage? Measure it and tell us. Because anecdotal storytelling tells you nothing. Hard data, hard evidence as to what difference did it make, to whom, what are the names of those beneficiaries, and in real terms, how did we change their lives? If that is not done, then CSR is just a repetitive doing more of the same. I also wanted to mention that our law does not criminalize any corporate. Therefore, if you do not spend your 2%, you're not put in handcuffs and sent to jail. What the legislation does is to take a very important principle from the United Nations system, which is called comply or explain, which has two facets. The companies that spend this money need to report it on their websites so that whatever they do in CSR is in the public domain. And secondly, those websites are linked to the government websites so that government in their social development ministry, corporate affairs ministry, have a clear, broad picture of what corporates have done in that financial year. If I were there to ask you, would the country of Oman, for example, tell us in the last 3 years what CSR activity has taken place in your country? Can any one person answer that question? And that question would be hard to answer because you don't have national statistics. But if you were to ask me, Dr. Chatterjee, what has India done in the last 3 years? Can you tell me? And I can tell you every project I can tell you the value of every project in rupee terms, in dollar terms. I can tell you where, in which geography, that project actually happened, which district, which state, which part of India. So when a researcher, let's say in Oman, wants to do research on CSR and wants to know what the data for India is, at one shot in the Ministry of Corporate Affairs database, any project you want to track in India, you can track. So you can then draw your charts, your graphs, your statistics. You can tell at a glance, for example, when I look at the last 3 years, that India spent out of the total kitty so much percentage on education, so much on health, so much on women's empowerment, so much on skill development. We can track all that. Another important thing is we can also track, did this money really go to the poor? Did they benefit the poorest areas of my country? So when I present in India, I present the map of India and I say, these are the better off states. The CSR money went here or not. This is the backward regions of my country. Did the CSR money go to the backward regions? I can track all that. And when we finished our 5 years, government said, for companies that spend CSR money in the really backward regions of the country, we will incentivize those corporations. So that money goes to the backward regions, the underdeveloped regions, and the poorer people. Because of this very comprehensive space that the legislation has opened up, which is not a forcible legislation, but an inclusive legislation, we have therefore allowed companies to come on board, not because they are forced to, but because they themselves want to. Companies have now realized that this is not a challenge, but an opportunity. It's a chance for companies to show how much they are doing for their country. And when they show that, how much it impacts their brand value. Madame Fatma, who spoke before me, also mentioned that today's youth actually is looking to be employed in companies that have good brand value, that have social identity, that have a social purpose. What we call them now as millennials are actually the best talent available. And they come to companies which have the best social identity. So it is in a real sense, and I'll stop here, it is in a real sense a win-win situation for the new generation of companies, and for the new generation that brings to my country a new India. We hope that with these submissions, they will be of some value to all of you. Thank you so much.